We're standing outside the amphitheater of Caesarea, and this is one of the most important parts of the site in terms of the narrative and the significance of what took place here. So unlike a theatre which is shaped as a half circle, the amphitheater goes all the way around, basically with two straight sides and then two semicircles at each end. And the difference in form is because of the difference in function between a theatre and an amphitheatre. Amphi basically means double, so you have the two sides, whereas with a theatre you have just one side. So this amphitheatre actually changed its function several times between a hippodrome, and hippodromos simply means horse running. It was used for horse races. And then at other times it was used as an arena. And when it was used as an arena, unfortunately this was a very bloody enterprise. And this is why there is so much sand behind me, because the sand would absorb the blood of the animals or of the people who were unfortunate enough to die in this arena. So the first level, if you will, of what took place here was animal fighting against animal. And this was so extraordinary in terms of the numbers of animals that actually died, that entire animal species became extinct during the Roman Empire. Now the next level up would be animal against human, and the people who fought here were of two kinds. One were prisoners, perhaps political prisoners that the Romans actually wanted to humiliate in front of the population. Because if you were a Roman citizen, you were allowed to use the theatre, you were allowed to frequent the amphitheater, and you could also go and use the bathhouses for free. So it could be used as a tool of humiliation. The other people who would fight here were called gladiators, and they were professional fighters. So you can imagine if you pit a political prisoner against a professional fighter, the outcome is not going to be very fair. Now, something else that took place behind me here is that the Roman Emperor Titus had a brother who was going to have a birthday, and he asked his brother, what would you like to have as a birthday present? And his brother replied, I would like to have dead Jews. And when he received 2,000 dead Jews on a plate, if you will, behind me, his response was, this is not enough dead Jews. Now this is pretty horrible in itself, but it surely begs some questions, such as, why were the Jews and the Romans at such enmity with one another? Why did they hate one another? Why did it get to the point that the Great Revolt actually broke out here in Caesarea, a little bit further up the coast to the north, when one Shabbat the Romans actually committed a sacrilege outside of the synagogue and they offered up some pigeons? And the Jewish people said, enough of this, we want to be able to live in freedom, we want to be able to worship our God, we want to be able to circumcise our children, we want to live according to the commandments that God has given us in the Torah. And so they rose up against the Romans, and the combined tragedy of the Great Revolt and then the revolt that came after it, the Backhoffer Revolt that takes place in 135 AD, it was said that this was as great of a tragedy as was the Holocaust, in terms of the proportion of Jewish people who perished, and of course in terms of the fact that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and the people were exiled from the land. So what was the problem? Why couldn't the Romans and the Jewish people live in peace together? Well, I think the answer is quite simple. It's due to two commandments given in our Torah, in the first 5 books of Moses, one of the most important of which was the Shema. And the Shema goes like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Or in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And the Shema is basically saying we have only one God. We are not allowed to worship other gods. And this is also told to us, of course, in the Ten Commandments. But this was a completely different concept than the Romans had. The Romans had a very pluralistic concept, and they would say, hey guys, if you'll bring your statue and put it in our temple, we'll worship it. But in turn, you will take a statue from our temple, you'll put it in your temple, and you will worship it. Now, of course, because the Jews have this idea of the Shema, of this one God, there's no way that we can worship other gods. In fact, one of the wonders of the ancient world was the temple in Jerusalem, in which there was no statue. It was the only temple on the face of the earth at that point in time that had no statue in it. So this already set the Jews in opposition to the Romans. It meant that we were not going to abide by their laws. And this was a very long-standing complaint against the Jewish people. I think the first time such a complaint was made was actually in the book of Esther, when Haman goes to Ahasuerus and he says to him, "These people are not like other peoples. They refuse to follow our laws. They refuse to bow down to our gods." And so he says to the king, "Let's get rid of them." Does this sound familiar? Are you aware of how this has happened time and time again in Jewish history? So the Romans is just one other example of a people group that would like to persecute the Jewish people because they refuse to fit in with their ideals. And I think this also relates to us as Christians today, does it not? We're called to be like salt, and we're called to be like light. We're supposed to be like a preservative. We're supposed to bring light into dark situations, and we're supposed to be different from the nations around us. There should be a different fragrance, a different smell about us that will attract the world to us. We don't need to become like the world to attract them. Rather, we need to be different and distinct, no matter how much trouble that may get us into. Now, another thing that got the Jewish people into trouble with the Romans was the fact that they couldn't eat with them. Up until the fact that the Apostle Peter is standing on the roof in Jaffa and he sees this vision of a sheet coming down from heaven with all of the animals in it, and he's told to kill and eat, and that he mustn't anymore call what God is calling clean unclean. In other words, he's allowed to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Up until this point, the Jewish people are not allowed to eat with Gentiles. And the Romans want them to come and eat in the houses with them. They want them to eat all of their unclean things. And so here is really the seed of the problem between the Jews and the Romans. Now, if we enter into this story, the Apostle Paul, who is actually put on trial somewhere here at Caesarea, he's imprisoned here for a couple of years, but he knows that this is not yet his final destination. So the Apostle Paul knows that this is not the final destination for his trial. He knows that he has to go to Rome and that he will be tried by the highest authority in Rome. And while he's there, he begins to write this letter that has been handed down to us as the book of Romans. And I think this letter is really deeply significant, and it shows to us that the enmity between the Jewish people and the pagans didn't end there. That sadly it was passed on and it became a seed in the church. And so you have the Apostle Paul penning these extraordinary lines. I'm just going to read a couple of them to you here because they are so significant. It says, "I say then, God has not rejected his people. May it never be." So evidently in the eyes of some Christians at that point, God had rejected his people. Why would the early Christians think that God had rejected the Jewish people? Well, it's quite simple. First of all, as the Jewish people are asking for Pilate to crucify Yeshua, at that point in time they say, "May his blood be on us and on our children." That's a pretty strong statement. And after that, they also do something else. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. And for the Christians living at that time, they take it as a sign that God has forsaken his people and that now he's turned to the Gentiles, that the Gentiles are now his children and he has forgotten about the Jews. Well, first of all, let's correct the first idea, because was it only the Jews that put Yeshua on the cross? Or was it also me? Was it also you? Was it the sins of mankind? In the book of Revelation it says that Yeshua is the Lamb that was slain from the foundation of the earth. In other words, it was always God's purpose that Yeshua would go to the cross so that all of mankind would be redeemed. So we can't pin all of the fault on the Jewish people. But evidently people at that time were already in 70 AD or 100 AD after the temple has fallen. And that's why the Apostle Paul has to say those words. And he continues with impassioned pleas to his listener. And he gets to the point that he's trying to explain to them, God has closed the eyes of the Jewish people to the identity of their Messiah, but he always intended to do that. It was always his plan and purpose to do that. Why would he do that? If I skip to verse 11, but please read the whole thing at home for yourselves. He says, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their false step, salvation has come to the Gentiles. And this is really a profound mystery. He had to close our eyes, the eyes of the Jewish people, in order that he could be revealed to the nations. Why did he need to do that? Well, when he was on the earth, if the Jewish people as a nation, of course there were many thousands of Jewish people who did receive him as Messiah, but if the entire nation had received him, what would we have done? We would have crowned him as king instead of nailing him to the cross. If he hadn't been nailed to the cross, the Gentiles could not have been brought in. Now in the second part of that verse he says something even more extraordinary. He says that salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. So it's like a double-edged sword. He's closed our eyes so that the Gentiles could be brought in, and now it's the time for the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. And perhaps in another one of these little clips we'll talk about how the Jewish people in these days are being provoked to jealousy by the witness of the Gentiles. Now he goes on to implore with the Gentiles and to explain to them that they have been grafted out of a wild olive branch and that they have been cultivated into the natural tree, and that actually in nature this cannot take place. And then in verse 25 he goes on to say, a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So what God is saying is that he is waiting until every last one of the Gentiles is safe in the sheepfold, and then, and only then, is he going to reveal himself to Israel as a nation, so that all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer shall come from Zion. He shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Concerning the good news, they are hostile for the sake of the Gentiles, but concerning chosenness, they are loved on account of the fathers, for the gifts and the calling are irrevocable. And I think in these days, the attitude of the Christians to the Jewish people is so important, and something that is on the heart of the Father is the restoration of this relationship that throughout the centuries has turned so sour, with the one persecuting the other. In the beginning, the Jewish people persecuting those who were coming to faith in Yeshua the Messiah, whether they were Jewish or whether they were Gentile. And then, of course, the Roman persecution of the Christians. And then after that, the tables were turned, and the Christians for centuries, until the modern day, began to persecute the Jewish people, until it got to the point that we have the full horror of the Holocaust unfolding. And sadly, that may not yet be the end of the story, because the Word of God speaks about something that it calls Jacob's trouble. And some people would understand that Jacob's trouble has already happened, but many people would say, no, it hasn't yet happened. This is still to come. And in the days that we're living in now, we can see that anti-Semitism is beginning to rise again on the face of the earth. And it is very important that if we follow the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, that we are not standing on the wrong side of his plans and his purposes. And we're going to talk more about this as we continue to travel around the land of Israel today.